This was my first week back with students for this school year, and a bunch of them now know I have the PC Building YouTube channel. And so, what a lot of them are actually asking me after class during passing time after school is, hey, I want to build a gaming PC. What should I build? And I realized I haven't done a super recent, like, hey, this is what you should build video. But also, when I make these videos, I want to do it like I teach, which is not just here's the answer, copy it exactly. I want to do more like here's why we would make these decisions, so that, for example, if the pricing changes or part availability changes, you understand why we made our choices, so you could adjust to a similar or different part that still suits your needs and is a good value. So we're going to be talking about how you make the decisions when you're choosing parts for a gaming PC to be good value and good performance, and you can be flexible and make other choices because you understand why we did it. Also, a huge mistake a lot of people make when they're upgrading their PC setup is not thinking enough about the desk they'll be putting everything on. For example, look at this utter disaster my wife received when she inherited a new classroom. And a huge thank you to FlexiSpot for reaching out a while back to sponsor an upgrade for it to an amazing new standing desk. It can be a perfect position for standing while typing, and you just feel a lot better when you're doing that, get up out of your seat. But it can also go down low enough for the preschoolers in her classroom to use, and honestly, the only issue we've had is that the other teachers at her school have been incredibly jealous of how awesome her new desk is, and FlexiSpot has been solving that problem as well by upgrading other teachers at the school. And the latest upgrade has actually been for my daughter's incoming kindergarten teacher, so hopefully we don't get any special treatment, or, okay, maybe I'm fine with it. I don't know, whatever. The point is, she really loved the customizability that FlexiSpot offered with choosing what type of color schemes and top design and all of that. So she went with a white top and white frame to match her classroom setup. It was 55-inch by 28 depth. Fits the classroom amazingly well. She is so happy. And also the teacher aides in the classroom enjoy that they're able to stand while grading and get up out of their seats. But also, again, it can go down to a sitting position, multiple memory positions. It's really useful. Everybody's loving it. Upgrade your desk by following the link in the video description and/or pinned comments, and check out the huge sales available. Now, once you have a great desk to put the PC on, okay, still what PC do we need to build? Now, when you're building a gaming PC, which is what I focus on and my students are asking about, the two most important parts are the CPU and the GPU. And a lot of people kind of misunderstand how these work together. So here's how I would think about it. When you're adjusting graphics settings in a game, or changing the resolution, maybe using DLSS performance mode or FSR performance mode to try to make it easier on your graphics card to get a higher frame rate, those things are reducing the burden on the graphics card. But most graphics settings changes don't have a very large effect on what the CPU has to do in a game, the kinds of things that it's doing, which means that your CPU, you could almost think of it as it's setting the max speed your PC can go. So it's like the top speed of your car, right? This is the max frames per second we could reach. In any given game and in any scene in that game, that maximum frame rate could be different, but your CPU is kind of setting the maximum it can reach. Now, whether you get to that or not depends on your GPU and what graphic settings you're using, but you can tweak those on the GPU to ease its burden to generally bring it up near how fast your CPU can go. But no matter how much you lower the burden on the GPU by changing the rendering resolution with upscaling or by reducing graphic settings, your PC will never go faster than the CPU is able to do, right? So in the end, I kind of think of it as setting your top speed, the maximum frames per second you can get, which again is different in every game and the scene you're doing in the game. So if there's a lot of like NPCs involved in a big city environment, or if you're in a multiplayer game where there's tons of people right there in the same location at the same time, or there's tons of physics stuff happening, that can be difficult on the CPU. Anyway, so for a good balanced gaming system, you do want a pretty capable CPU, but honestly, many people are playing at resolutions and graphic settings where they end up GPU limited anyway, as long as they have a fairly decent CPU. So I would definitely put more money towards the GPU. Now, that being said, if you're into multiplayer competitive gaming, like exclusively, and you are extremely competitive and you need like 1,000 frames per second in Counter-Strike and 500's not good enough, and you're always turning everything down to low graphic settings and using DLSS performance or FSR performance mode, try to get, top it out and be CPU limited, limited, then you might want to go higher end on the CPU just because that's kind of your style of play. But for a balanced build, now we're going to go with something reasonable. Also, we need to choose AMD or Intel. Now, currently, Intel has been struggling with stability issues on their latest generations of desktop CPUs. With 13th and 14th gen, they have issued a microcode update that is supposed to stop CPUs from degrading if they haven't already degraded. But that hasn't been out long enough for me to really consider it verified that that has actually solved the problem. So with that in mind, I am going to personally go towards the AMD route. They also still offer very good just bang for the buck anyway. Now with AMD's latest gen though, I wouldn't recommend going for the 9000 series processors for gaming. So for example, with a Ryzen 9000 series processor, the cheapest one currently available is the 9600. That's still coming in at $270. And then going up from there with like the 9700, that's $350. These are pretty expensive. Now, the previous generation lowest end part, like the 7600, there's like a 7500F that's available in some regions, but not major retailers in the US, so I'm not going to be talking about that one. Maybe in your region it could be a good option. But anyway, the Ryzen 7600 is kind of our lower end part for the 7000 series. The 9000 series is only a couple percent faster in gaming. It's better at a lot of other things, but not at gaming. So, and look at this, coming in at around $182 or $187 here for either the 7600 or 7600X. You see we're saving a lot of money by going with the previous generation Ryzen processor instead of the latest generation and getting about the same performance. So I think this is good. Now, if you're going to be a super low budget build, you might have to look lower than this and go back to even older generations. But I think this is a pretty decent sweet spot for a good value, but not absolutely scraping the bottom of the barrel gaming PC. Now, you got the 7600X or non-X. The main differences here is the 7600 non-X will generally come with a boxed-in CPU cooler. Although, check the exact listing to be sure it really does. It also runs at a lower power draw. Running at that lower power draw means it's clocked slightly lower, which will affect your performance by a few percent. But again, our CPU is kind of setting our top speed we can reach, and oftentimes we're GPU limited anyway. So if our top speed is adjusted slightly and we're still above where our GPU settings are going to be, you're not really going to notice the difference in gaming. So I'd say grabbing lower wattage to maybe have less heat going out into my room. Obviously, you could run this one at reduced settings anyway. But anyway, the point is, coming with the box cooler adds value. We might not necessarily keep it, but anyway, I'm just going to say it's a few dollars less and it'll perform about the same. I'm going to go with the 7600 non-X, but the X version would be fine. Now, if somebody's like, I need 8 cores, not 6 cores, I'll say that for gaming, it doesn't matter a whole lot, but you could look at parts like the 7700X or non-X, but notice that those are up around $275, so it's a lot more money to get those 2 additional cores, which for gaming is not going to end up being a world of difference in the gaming performance. If you do other heavy multi-core tasks, that's where you might want to spend more on more cores. All right, and if you want the absolute fastest gaming CPU right now, get the 7800X3D, but that's about $400, and so that's kind of more top-end build, not good value build. Anyway, so for a CPU cooler, you could just use the box cooler that comes with this CPU, but it will be a little bit noisier and things like that. So you can usually spend $20 or $30 on a good enough CPU cooler. Something like the Thermalright Peerless Assassin 120 will actually cool this CPU completely fine. I could just slot that in for $35. If you need to cut $35 off your build to afford it, then just lose the CPU cooler, keep the box cooler, and you saved yourself $35. Anyway, you need a compatible motherboard to go with your CPU. So once you've selected your CPU, that limits your motherboard options. That being said, there's still a lot of options. So generally with the Ryzen 7000 series, we're on the AM5 platform, but there's several tiers of boards here. There's A620, B650, B650E, X670, and X670E. This can affect things like whether you get as much, PCIe Gen 5 in various places and how many. It can affect a lot of things. The point is that B650, though, and B650E are generally good enough. A620s, kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. If you, again, really need to save money on your build, you can consider that. There's some trade-offs I would generally say B650, 650E, X670, X670E would be the route I would go. In other words, kind of eliminate the A620. I'm using my filters to do that. And then we can sort prices low to high. By the way, I'm using PC Part Picker to do all of this. I'm not sponsored by them in any way. It just seems it's a convenient place to throw together builds. Now, if we're looking at our B650 boards and up, we can see that the lowest price is $100, and then they go up from here, and they go up considerably from here. And then you can get into the X670s. Which start coming in around more like $200. So you can spend a lot of money on a motherboard. You can go up to $300, $400, $500. You can go over $1,000 on a motherboard. Here's the thing. If the motherboard runs your CPU at the speed it's supposed to run at, which most of them do, especially for Ryzen 5 7600. If you're running the higher end chips though, the VRMs might not be able to quite take the full power. So I will say that our particular CPU here could probably run fine on any of these, even if it has bad VRMs. Now that being said, if you might upgrade in the future, you might want to spend a little more on a board that actually can have a little bit of upgradable potential for a higher powered chip. Another thing I will say is the motherboard you pick affects a lot of things like how many USB slots you get. Do you want built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth? Now, when I talk to my students, most of them, don't have an Ethernet cord in their bedroom where they want to put their PC. And actually, I used to where I had my old house, but at my new house, I also don't have an Ethernet cord right here. So for me, having Wi-Fi on the board is actually going to be, I think, pretty handy. So if we search for boards with Wi-Fi, we're now starting at $130 and up. But if you don't need Wi-Fi, you can save a little bit of money here. Now I'm looking at these options, and I'm just going to be like, okay, so how can I tell if any of these are good? Well, one thing you could do is look up motherboard roundups. Like Hardware Unboxed does these. They also publish text articles at TechSpot. There we go. And they'll do things like round up a whole bunch of motherboards and then show you graphs of running a higher powered chip on the board for a while in Cinebench and seeing if it reduces the performance because it's kind of overheating or unable to maintain the high power levels that the higher end chips can draw. So then you can kind of see which ones are at, like reducing our performance significantly versus giving us like the full performance. And then you can kind of look at, okay, are any of these the motherboards that we have available right here? And so if I go ahead and look at this, kind of scrolling through here, okay, we have the ASRock B650M Pro RS with Wi-Fi. And as far as I can tell, that's basically the ASRock B650M Pro RS. We have the Wi-Fi version, so unless they're doing something awful with their naming scheme by the Wi-Fi version actually being worse than the non-Wi-Fi version, I'm going to assume, hopefully I'm not wrong, that this matches up with that, and this should be a pretty good board. And it wasn't anywhere near the top of our expense list. We're at $150 here. Now, to be clear, could we have gone with a $100 motherboard that doesn't have Wi-Fi and has worse VRMs that would probably still run our RX 7600, our Ryzen 7600 just fine? Yes, we totally could have. So again, there's already about $85 we could cut from this build if you're on a lower budget. You could cut $50 off the motherboard and you could lose this CPU cooler, okay? So if you're ultra budget, there is room to save here. I'm just kind of going more kind of middle of the road. We're paying for a little more on features and niceness of our PC. Anyway, now along with the CPU, its performance can also be kind of limited by the memory. And memory works in two ways. The RAM is another word for this. So you have the capacity, how much you have, and then you have its speed, how fast it runs. Now, as far as capacity goes, well, you could get by with 16 gigabytes of RAM. It's really not advised. It's not that much more money to get 32 gigabytes, and especially if you're running a game and anything else in the background, like a few Chrome tabs, a video, something like that. Limiting yourself to 16 is probably not the best idea if you're not trying to scrounge up every single dollar from your build. So I'm going to go to our memory filters here, and I'm going to go 2 by 16. So we want two 16 gigabyte chips to get us the capacity that we want. Now, if we sort prices low to high, you'll notice that these speeds can be different. DDR5 4800, DDR5 5600. Also, there's CAS latency. So in the case of speeds, the speed higher is better. latency, lower is better. And both things end up affecting the effective speed of the RAM. You could look at this first word latency to kind of look at how those play together. So something with a higher speed but lower latency might actually have a better first word latency than something, with it flipped. Now, for AMD Ryzen processors, for both the 7000 and 9000 generations, AMD has generally claimed that going up to DDR5 6000, so I'm going to take my speed filter and filter for 6000 and up, is the sweet spot. And actually going beyond this might not even get you better performance because you get into complicated stuff like the whether the fabric is running in a 1-to-1 ratio with the RAM. And anyway, the point is, DDR5 6000 is a pretty good way to go. It's not that much more expensive than the lower end stuff. But then we also want to look at our CAS latencies, right? Because lower is better. So if our cheapest DDR5 6000 starts at $86, spending a few dollars more for a significantly lower latency might make sense. Like we can start getting down to 30 right here at $91. So it's only a few dollars more to go all the way down to a CAS latency of 30. So anyway, that's good. But when you're choosing RAM, you also want it to be compatible with your CPU and motherboard. Now, if you want to be ultra careful, you can check your motherboard's website, and they should have a QVL list, a qualified vendor list for your motherboard, and it would list RAM kits that they are specifically, telling you are for sure compatible. However, there's going to be a vast number of RAM chips that are not on the QVL list that are still compatible. So generally, that's a bit overkill. It's a bit being overcautious. That being said, if I pull up some of these RAM chips, like the absolute cheapest ones, like the Silicon Power one right here, sometimes they won't say that they have an AMD Expo profile. So if I pop over to the Amazon page here, notice that this one, if I scroll down here, it states that it supports Intel XMP profile, but it doesn't ever mention any AMD profile. Might still work fine on an AMD motherboard. But why we would want these profiles is that when you set up your PC, the RAM's actually going to run a lot slower than its advertised speed unless you go into the motherboard BIOS and set the faster speeds. And that's easiest if it has it as a preset option you can just select that's either an XMP profile or an AMD Expo profile. I think one motherboard brand might even call one of it DocP or something like that. But because this one's not mentioning AMD anywhere on here, I'm going to look for if there's one around the same price that does mention AMD. I'm going to go ahead and try that out. So for example, if we're looking at these CL30 options, looks like we have one here for just a few dollars more from Team Group. So let's go ahead and check if this Team Group option actually specifically lists AMD Expo. And it does, all right? So it specifically lists AMD Expo compatible. So I'll spend the extra couple of dollars for a little bit more, assurance that this is gonna work nicely with my AMD setup here. All right, so now we've got the core of our system going. We do need some sort of, system storage to install install the operating system, to install games, to save files, all of that. Now, you would definitely want an SSD, and you probably want an M.2 NVMe SSD to slot into the motherboard rather than the old-fashioned, SATA SSDs. Also, regarding capacity, how much do you want? I would say at a minimum 1 terabyte, and then you can add in more later. I wouldn't buy anything less than 1 terabyte. Personally, I'd probably go 2 terabytes or even 4 terabytes because I use a lot of space. I have a lot of games installed at the same time. If you're somebody who tends to have like 5 or 6 games installed at the same time or more, or you might want a higher capacity. If you're the kind of person who plays 1 or 2 games at a time, maybe there's one multiplayer game you like that you play all the time, and then you might play one single player game and uninstall it when you're done and then install the next one, you're probably fine with a lower capacity drive. But if you're somebody who plays a lot of games and leaves them all installed on your system, you might want to go up to 2, 3, 4 terabytes, but you can always add in more storage later, so you don't have to buy it right off the bat. So I'm going to sort for SSDs that are at least 1 gigabyte, and then sort prices low to high. Notice that some of these are these SATA drives. I could have just filtered those out, I guess. And as you scroll down, you start to get M.2 drives. Now, some of them are PCIe 3.0, some of them will be PCIe 4.0. And generally 4.0 is faster than 3.0, although not every 4.0 drive is created equal. I'm checking how the prices kind of started out around $50 and they're going up from there. We're not super far up. This Team Group MP33 is only a PCI 3.0. It has a lot of good reviews though. Let me just open this up and we'll see what we think here. So if I pop this one open, notice, okay, we're coming in about $58. Our speeds here are only like 1800, 1500. Now that's honestly probably fine, but I think we can get a faster speed for a similar price. So I'm gonna go ahead and maybe keep looking if we paid maybe a little bit more, if we get something a little bit faster. So for example, okay, we've got a Team Group Z440 Lite. This is PCIe 4.0. And you can kind of open that one up and take a look at what we're seeing here. So here we're seeing that this one is advertising speeds of that it can even work with a PS5. It's going to be 5,000, 4,200. So see, this one's a lot faster for just a little bit more money, and it's still 1 terabyte. So again, you could compare all of the different drives, but these are similar speeds and prices. So I'm going to go ahead and slot that one in as just kind of a placeholder. And again, you could go up to 2 terabytes or more if you think you need to. Okay, next thing on the list is video card. So along with the CPU, again, the GPU or video card is the most important choice. I think it is the most important choice. It's probably worth putting most of your money into this. Now, I do entire videos on what is the best graphics card to buy at various price points. So you could definitely look at those videos for a lot more of my full thoughts on choosing a graphics card. Another thing to consider is what type of monitor you'll be buying, which I would cover in a separate video, but the resolution you're gaming at also can have a big impact on how much graphics card you need. If you're on a 1080p monitor, you don't necessarily need to go quite as high end. If you're on 1440p, you might want a little higher end on the GPU, and if you're at 4K, you definitely want to go pretty high end on the GPU, or maybe don't go with the 4K screen. Now, DLSS and FSR have made that a lot less strict because you can use a lot of aggressive upscaling to render the game at a lower internal resolution and go a lot and get a lot of performance without losing a huge amount of the image quality. So that kind of has muddied that old kind of standing advice on your GPU is kind of heavily dependent on your monitor resolution. But anyway, one thing I would say is if we're spending a lot of money on a gaming PC, it better be faster than a PlayStation 5. And the PlayStation 5 Pro is probably coming out soon as well. So that's one thing to consider. So the PlayStation 5 is roughly an RX 6700-ish level of performance. That's the non-XT version, but those are kind of gone right now. The 6700 XTs would actually be faster than what's in a PS5. And the 6750 XT is basically the same thing, but sometimes it's actually in better stock and lower price. So I'll say that if you're trying to keep the budget kind of down to a reasonable price, but still beat a PlayStation 5, a 6750 XT at $300 could be a pretty reasonable choice. And you can see we're coming in definitely more expensive than a PS5, but our CPU and GPU are both more powerful than what is in a PS5. So at least there's that. We're spending more, but we're also getting more. If you want to buy an NVIDIA GPU around $300, unfortunately, you'd be getting the RTX 4060, which only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM and is actually like 20% or so slower than a 6750 XT. So I would, if I was at around this price point, say that the 6750 XT is a standout value. But I'm also going to go with a couple other price points where we could go with some other standout value cards. Another standout value, if it's still in stock, is the 6800 non-XT, because this gets you up to 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It's even faster. It's similarly priced to 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, which is noticeably slower and only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if you could spend a little bit more, going up to a 6800 non-XT could make a lot of sense. Now, if you can go even higher, again, putting more money into the graphics card almost always pays off. Whether there's diminishing returns, sure, but you generally can use the extra power on running your game at higher settings or higher frame rates or having more longevity. 6800 XT versions are often priced fairly low. I can see one here right now at $430. And that's comparable to a 7800 XT in performance, which is noticeably more expensive. And is not much, it's actually fairly competitive with like a 4070 from NVIDIA, which is going up all the way to $520. So for me, I would say 6800 XT is probably going to compete pretty well with even a PS5 Pro. It's going to be a lot stronger than a PS5. And we're probably about $100 cheaper right now than the closest NVIDIA alternative with the RTX 4070, although that does get you the better upscaler and better ray tracing performance. So I'm going to slot in the 6800 XT right now for our build, but then we'll talk more about some other GPU choices that we could make along the way. But how about we finish up the build with a case and a power supply? So the case, this is basically, it needs to fit the parts. And I would recommend buying a case that comes with fans so that you don't have to pay money buying fans separately, because generally the case manufacturer can get a better deal on a bulk purchase of fans than you're going to be able to. So if you buy a case, also I would recommend a case that has mesh, so it has some airflow. Now, you could just sort cases low to high, you could just look at anything, but honestly the case is also going to be the thing that you see, right? So this is really going to be massive personal preference. So I would say, unless you're really, really into what your PC looks like, probably try to keep it under $100, and you can get something decent for $50. But like I said, make sure it has a mesh for airflow, and make sure it's big enough to fit your parts, and make sure it comes with some fans in it. So I'm kind of scrolling through here to see if anything sort of stands out to me right now. Something like this, let's see, I don't know, this Montec Air 903 Max looks like it comes with some fans. Maybe you want the RGB, it has a mesh front. So this is probably fine. It's $75. Could you probably find a better case for similar or more money? Sure. Could you? But this, like I said, mostly a placeholder. Don't spend too much more than this on a case, and make sure it fits your parts, has good airflow, and comes with fans. But again, it's mostly personal preference on what you want your PC to look like, really. Now, power supply, I've got a lot more to talk about. The first thing I want to point out is there's something called the PSU tier list, PSU cultist tier list. I'll try to remember to link this in the video description. If I don't, just like Google search PSU tier list, and this thing should pop up. Now, this goes from like tier A, tier B, tier C, and so on, to give you a rough idea of how good a power supply is, because there's a lot more to it than how many watts it advertises. And you don't want to like accidentally fry your PC with some kind of like terrible choice on your power supply. So that being said, to power our parts right now, we don't need a massive power supply. But power supplies are something you can keep for years. So if you get something that's like 750 or 850 watts, you can probably support huge GPU upgrades in the future. You could use this thing forever. Also, to sort out quality, like these 80 plus ratings are not quality ratings, they're efficiency ratings, but it can still help sort out some of the nonsense if we go 80 plus gold and better. And then I would want... we could go 650 watts, but I'm going to go 750 just because you can support almost any GPU upgrade on a reasonable CPU with something like this. Now, I'm going to kind of scroll through our options here, but we're going to go prices low to high. Now, some of these, like Apevia, if you check that PSU cultist tier list, are going to be pretty low on the tier list. Also, Thermaltake has some good stuff, but I think their GX line is going to be low on the PSU tier list, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head. But if I remember right, Thermaltake's GF1 line, or actually I think their GF3 line is actually pretty high-end, and I think it also has the newer 12-pin power connector, where if you go with a newer like NVIDIA graphics card, you won't need the dongle. This will just connect right into the graphics card without needing the adapter. So that would be kind of nice to have, and this is fairly low on our price list. So I'm not going to say it is for sure the only choice you could possibly make here, but it's coming in at $90. Let me double check that the GF line is actually good quality from Thermaltake. So we're going to search Thermaltake. I'm using Control F for Thermaltake. and it's saying GF3 less than or equal to 1200 watts is on tier A high end. So as I understand it, Thermaltake GF3, it seems to fall into that range. So I'm going to go ahead and slot that in here. But again, there's a lot of other good quality power supplies for around this $90 to $100 range. So you could, again, just check the tier list to make sure it's not complete crap, and you could choose something else, especially if you're, the prices change by the time you're looking at this video. So if we go ahead and zoom out, we're in here at about $1,100. So with this build, if you need to get down to $1,000 and you don't want to cut any performance, cut the motherboard down to $100 or so and lose the CPU cooler. And if you do that, you're going to drop down right to slightly over $1,000. So if you need to cut it to $1,000 without losing a lot of performance, maybe go that route. If you need to cut it further, you could cut the graphics card, like I said, a 6750 XT or something like that. And you can consider going back to an even older CPU platform, but that would need like a whole different video for me to talk about it. The last thing I'll say is, well, what if you have a higher budget? If you wanted to throw more money at this build, I would absolutely throw it at the graphics card. So I think this build could support almost the sky's the limit on the graphics card. Although if you're going up to 4090, I'd probably go up to at least an 850 watt power supply. But literally, I'd be happy throwing a 4080 into this build, and it wouldn't be that ridiculous. So that being said, let's kind of scale the graphics card from here. So if you go above this price point, I think the 4070 Super is where NVIDIA starts to make a lot of sense. Those are coming in closer to $600 though. They're still 12 gigabyte cards, which honestly, if you're gaming at 1440p or lower, I wouldn't be too concerned about. You're also getting the better ray tracing performance and access to a better upscaler, which I think is huge. So I think grabbing a 4070 Super could be a really good choice here. If you prefer AMD, the 7900 GRE would probably be the next step up that would be worth paying for, and that's at $530. But for me, I'd say, 4070 Super if you want to go with an Intel version of this build. And if you do that, notice that our price is now $1,274. So that does add to our build price. But the 4070 Super is faster than the 6800 XT. It does have a better upscaler and better ray tracing performance, although it does only have 12 gigabytes of VRAM. That's the only downside, I guess, to that, besides the price difference. Now, this is where probably most reasonable builds might stop. But again, you could continue to slot in higher-end graphics cards onto this build, and nothing would be out of place. You're going to be perfectly fine. You could go up to something like a 4070 Ti Super if you want an NVIDIA GPU that has the 16 gigabytes of VRAM and tons of performance. It is a lot more money here, but that's going to put you up to a little under $1,500. So if I was spending about $1,500, that's probably where I would go. Again, if you're not too hung up on losing out on some of the NVIDIA feature set, you could go with something like a 7900 XT, which also has lots of VRAM, in this case 20 gigabytes of VRAM, and that's coming in a little under $700, so that saves you a bit. So if you need to be closer to $1,400, $1,350, fitting in that 7900 XT is a good choice. But again, at this point, I'm basically just redoing my best GPUs to buy video at different price points, so you could revisit that. Like I said, I think this build could go even as high as a 4080 Super, and I don't think that's at all out of place. And we could do this would be like the highest end I would go here, and past this point I would probably throw more money at the CPU before I went to a 4090, because 4090s get really expensive. So if I was doing the $1,650 version of this build, I'd throw that 4080 Super in, and then if I still had more money to spend, I would switch out the 7600 for the best gaming CPU, which is the 7800 X3D, which I can tell you right now, if this is saying $230, that is a scam. Amazon has a lot of scams right now. That's nonsense. It's going to be about $400. So anyway, that'd be a $400 CPU. That is not a $220 CPU. So anyway, watch out for the Amazon scams on that. So that would put us up kind of closer to that $1,800 mark. So anyway, hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. Give you some thought process behind all of the different price points on gaming PCs and everything. So There you go. I've got to get my kids to gymnastics practice. So I'm going to let you guys go, but I'll probably put links to things down there if I remember to in the description. And if I don't, well, I talked you through all of it. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.